With the seemingly never-ending bear market that has hung over the cryptocurrency industry for months, it can be difficult to see the big picture. Where are we headed? Why are we doing this? What are cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin any good for anyway? However, there are still some individuals who have managed to keep fresh and innovative views on what crypto may be capable of in the future. One of these individuals is Miko Matsumura. Among many other things, Miko is the co-founder of the Evercoin cryptocurrency exchange and general partner at Gumi Cryptos. Recently, finance magnates spoke with Miko about his belief that money is software, as well as Evercoin's role in the present and future cryptocurrency economies. Okay, so Miko, thanks again for being on the show. Can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the cryptocurrency industry?
Absolutely. So, I've been in Silicon Valley for probably 30 years or so. And, I really have been fairly consistently working on open source software projects. I think my first big project here in the Valley was, I'm getting a little bit of an echo actually. There's kind of a
I'll turn it.
funny, I don't
Yeah.
know what
Is
it
that any
is.
better?
Yeah, why don't we take it from the top? It was kind of I don't know, a little digital blurpy sound. I don't know what
Ah, okay. All right, from my
you know
end.
what that is.
But you're not getting the echo anymore.
Let's see. No, I think it's okay now.
Okay.
Anyhow, uh, why don't we?
Yeah, I'll take it from the top. So Miko, can you just start by telling us a little bit about yourself and how you got involved in the cryptocurrency industry?
Sure. So I have two major affiliations. One of them is that I'm a co-founder of the Evercoin exchange.
Mhm.
I'm also a general partner with Gumi Cryptos, which is a venture capital fund dedicated to crypto investment. So, in terms of how did I get involved in this space, I've been about 30 years here in Silicon Valley, and I've been working with venture capitalists, and raising money and building startups and working on open source software. So, for me, with respect to this, industry, probably my first interaction. I mean, there are obviously faint glimmerings of this whole phenomenon coming from the internet, but the first time it really hit me in the face, I was at the Coupa Cafe in Palo Alto, and they had a Bitcoin checkout. So, I'm definitely not as early in this game as folks that you might have had on the show like Charlie Lee, OG Bitcoiner type of person. So I saw this Bitcoin checkout, and I looked at it and I was thinking like, wow, you can buy a cup of tea with Bitcoin, which I had heard of, but at that moment it really dawned on me to try mining. So I tried mining at home, really with the goal of buying a cup of tea. So that was sort of my aspiration. And it really kind of reminded me of this kind of feeling of the early internet, and the whole thing of like, I'm going to build my own website, using HTML and
Mhm.
Telnet and VI and all, just really these kind of creaky initial tools. So I really I enjoyed that exercise, but eventually what I came to realize is that we were talking about not open source software, but open source money, which is a phrase that comes from the website bitcoin.org. So it's open source money is definitely a Satoshi thing, and
Mhm.
but I really got turned on to that idea because if you've been in Silicon Valley for 30 years, you've really watched open source software effectively dominate software. And so,
Mhm.
with the recent, one of the largest tech acquisitions of all time was Red Hat, purchased by IBM recently. Recently $6.5 billion acquisition of MuleSoft by Salesforce.com. We also have, I guess it's just called Salesforce now.
Mhm.
But we've had some recent pretty major, events. Obviously, the purchase of GitHub by Microsoft, another big event in open source. So when you look at, open source software, it's really seeps into every crack of software and eventually kind of takes it over. So, if you look at the concept of open source money, my thesis has been that open source money will essentially, you know, seep into every single crack of proprietary money. It's going to kind of take over every money use case. And the thing that's interesting about that thesis is that, it's predicated on the idea that money is software. And I think that's where a lot of intellectual debate occurs, because I think that there are lots of people, including famous economists, who they're not software people, right? So the famous economists don't actually consider money to be software. And so, if you don't consider money to be software, it's pretty hard to have a rational debate with me, because that's essentially, so at that point we're not able to agree, right? Because my foundational axiom is that money is software, and and I can elaborate a little bit on that, but from my perspective, that's really what caused me to kind of like in the eyes of many traditionalists, sort of lose my mind and go all in into this industry. And when I say going all in, I'm really talking about kind of spending all of my work hours on this, but really, from the perspective of a portfolio investor, obviously I continue to hold real assets and non-crypto assets. So, it's obvious that, you need to have proper exposure to various, diverse asset classes. Otherwise you're just not rational.
Yeah. So yeah, I would love to hear more about this idea that money is software. Like, what are sort of the criteria that would make something like money software?
Yeah, so it's so funny, right? Because I feel like people, the the thing that I'm trying to say with the phrase money is software is I'm not trying to redefine the word money according to my own terms. I think that's
Mhm.
quite unfair, and it is fairly meaningless in terms of an exercise. The the thing that I'm trying to get people to wake up to with the phrase money is software is not that the definition of money is dependent on the existence of software, right? Because that's provably false, right? Like, we actually have had historical currencies that were the official definition of money, but were
Mhm.
actually not software, right? So to me, like, that's, I just want to be very clear that that's not what I'm trying to do, because that's kind of a fool's errand. What I want to say about money as software, though, is that um, money in today's modern context effectively expresses its meaning through software and is therefore largely dependent on software,
Okay.
right? And that's really what I'm getting at, right? And so the question then becomes, if you take any modern person, like consider the audience of this show, right? Like, the audience of the show is most likely using some form of digital technology to access the show and to hear our voices, right? So
Mhm.
they're obviously electronically engaged internet, people, right? So from that perspective, I'd like everyone to kind of think about what the last 10 interactions they had with money, right? And so I think about the 10 interactions I had with money, and it's a lot of credit card swiping. There's button clicking happening on Amazon. If you look at your bank, there's kind of electronic bank transfers, wire transfers. There's all kinds of things like that, right? So, ultimately, I guess what I'm saying is the vast majority of interactions, and obviously there's cryptocurrency transactions for most people in the audience as well. But, like, you know, if you go to a place like Starbucks and you try to buy a coffee, like, you know, there, even if you pay with cash, the reason why I say the meaning is expressed through software is that the person who takes the cash money actually has to enter that fact into the cash register, and the cash register has to, electronically reconcile the custody of that cash asset, right? So in terms of the expression of the meaning of that transaction, right, the expression of the meaning of the transaction can be read either on the receipt or on that little screen, right? So you can get little outputs like decaf latte, grande, whatever. Like that's the
Mhm.
meaning of the transaction, right? So I guess what I'm really trying to say is, and the question then becomes like, well, so what do you get from doing this exercise, right? Like, what do you get from like asserting this to be the case? So the thing that you get is you get some additional assertions that really skew the debate further, right? And the assertions that you get are, that you then need to understand how software behaves in order to reason about what will happen to money. And the thing that I think is missing from the debate that's really interesting from my perspective is that um, we really need to talk about software in the context of packages,
Mhm.
software packages, especially open source software, right? Like people talk about products, but really open source software doesn't travel in products, it really travels in packages. And the thing that people insist on, there are people that do accept that money is digital.
Mhm.
But one of the biggest misconceptions about that is that they think that it is data. So they think money is data. They don't think money is software, right? And if they think money is data, you get into trouble, right? You get in trouble. And, it's an easy mistake to make in reasoning, right? So let me give you an example. Like, let's say I have $10 and you have $10, right?
Mhm.
So if I pay you $1, then I have $9 and you have $11, right? So like, it's really, really easy to think, oh, well, that's just data, right? So, I've given you $1, and so the data on my end reflects me giving you the dollar, and the data on your end, but the thing that I think you miss when you do that, first of all, is you really deeply miss a fundamental understanding of what's happening. Because
Mhm.
when you conceive of money as data, you actually lose the properties of money. And what I mean by you lose the properties of money is that if money were data, I would pay you $1. You would have $11, right? And technically, I would still have $10. And the reason why I would have $10 is that data, the nature of data is copy,
I
right? So
see.
I would
Yeah.
give you a copy of $1, and you would have a copy of the dollar. That's the nature of data. So you're really missing it. And the point that I was driving at with respect to packages is that the other thing that people expect if they think money is data flows easily across packages. So if the soul of money were data, then you would have essentially a monolithic software that addresses all money use cases. And so as soon as you apprehend that money is actually software, then you understand that there are packages. So where am I going with this? Where I'm going with this is that if you go to a Starbucks and you buy a coffee, you could buy with cash, but you can also buy with a gift card, or you can also buy with a credit card, or you can also buy with a debit card, right? You can also buy with their handy dandy app, the mobile app, right? Every single one of these different, and that may be a credit card, but the mobile app itself is actually a piece of software, and in addition to using the credit card system. So the thing
Yeah.
that I'm trying to elucidate here is that every single payment channel is actually a unique software package. And similarly, ACH or Swift, these are every single money use case has different packages of software. And I think one of the biggest things people miss is they miss this notion. And so what they end up with is they end up with weird assertions like Bitcoin can't be money because it only handles one money use case, which is apparently this sort of Swiss bank account store of value
Mhm.
type of censorship resistant store of value type of use case, with kind of partial pseudonymity, but I guess the thing that is really interesting about that is that why insist, right? Like, for example, if you go into GitHub and you look at software, you'll realize that there are databases and there are web application servers, but there are very few monolithic database web application server combinations, right? So the insistence that any single so-called cryptocurrency handles every single possible money use case is definitely a fundamental misunderstanding. And so I think we've had essays in even the New York Times by famous economists that say things like, um, you can't buy a sandwich with Bitcoin, therefore it's not money, therefore it's worth zero, right?
Yeah.
Which is just like a really astonishing kind of set of, and even if you start with faulty axioms, that's just logically like rubbish as an argument.
Yeah.
So
Mhm.
anyhow, so I guess the reason why I'm kind of going into such detail is I really want people to understand the thesis that I hold, which is open source money, and the thing that I think has been good about this thesis is that the thesis is uh, it's sort of what I would characterize as being largely price insensitive, in the
Mhm.
sense that it it posits that the same thing that happened in open source software to software will happen in open source money to proprietary money. So that means, and it's a little bit time insensitive and it's a little bit price insensitive. It's just really an inevitability.
So
Um,
what would that look like sort of on a practical level if we're switching from, these like centralized currencies, for example, to something like Bitcoin or other cryptocurrencies? You said briefly that, no one crypto is going to cover every single use case. So does that mean that like there will be lots of different cryptocurrencies, or will it be sort of one network that comes in a lot of different packages? Sort
that
of.
there has to be multiple different uh, sort of representations of value. The
Mhm.
question becomes, what's the user experience?
Okay.
Because the thing that's interesting about kind of a user experience is, the user experience can be made to appear the same despite the traversal across multiple different substrates, right?
Right.
So,
Okay.
you can have things like, exchanges, and the exchanges can be kind of dynamically inserted that seamlessly translate one medium to another medium, on an as needed basis. So, to me, does that suggest the existence of one or multiple currencies? The reason, I think the flaw in the debate becomes, how do you define the word currency and how do you define multiple currencies? Maybe the user experience is only of one, but if you really look at it from a software perspective, you're probably going to require multiple software packages because, today nobody uses a Swiss bank account to buy a sandwich, and so and obviously there are ways to mitigate that. Like, you can go to Switzerland, open a bank account, and then you can get a credit card that draws on that bank account. But I guess what I'm saying is you're not using the ACH protocol to buy a sandwich. You're
Yeah.
using the credit card protocol. The credit card protocol then is essentially attached to your Swiss bank account. And even so, I think the human value is there, which is that, the I'm sure there are people with credit cards tied to bank accounts that happen to be in Switzerland, but particularly people from Switzerland. But I think when we say the phrase Swiss bank account, I think we're really thinking of a specific use case, right? Which is really kind of a long-term and semi-anonymous store of value. So that's kind of the mindset.
Why is this an inevitability, as you said?
Yeah. So to me, basically the thing that makes this inevitable is very simple, which is, if you have a long study of open source software, what you begin to realize is that the marketplace of open source software effectively is a marketplace that competes on an alternative basis from the real economy, which is that what the open source economy competes on is it competes on the basis of consent. So, it's a very weird substrate. Typical economics are competitive on the basis of um, basically economic, on an economic basis, right? Which is really interesting. And the reason why I'm framing it this way is that, if you go into like a GitHub, you'll see, what I claim to be $1 trillion worth of licensable software, all with a price tag of 0, right?
Mhm.
Now, I can say that I claim that it's $1 trillion, based on a bunch of, mumbo jumbo equations of how much work went into it. But, in reality, the fair market value of all of the software in GitHub is 0, right? So it's free, right?
Mhm.
And that's, and you can get into the nuances of economics and pricing and things like that, but I'm just being very general with the way I frame it.
Mhm.
But I guess the reason why I wanted to kind of frame it that way is that the total incentive for developers to participate in those projects economically is actually quite low, right? Because what do you
Right.
get out of contributing to open source? Not much. You get like honor, if it's a great package, your software gets to be immortal, which I
Mhm.
think is a pretty good. You may get some benefit to your resume. As you start to get more enterprisey, some of the benefits can be, you know, you can uh, fix a patch on behalf of your employer that's using
Mhm.
the open source software and that no one else will fix, right? So, if you have a bug that only, affects your organization, then you can fix the bug. Your organization will be happy because it's dependent on that software, and then you can contribute that patch back to open source, presumably as kind of a way to help other people. So traditionally, what's happened in places like the internet and places in the real world is the so-called tragedy of the commons. And
Mhm.
what's funny about what's happened in open source is what I call the comedy of the commons, which is this kind of bizarre inversion of the race to the bottom, right? Which is that what we've seen inside of GitHub is sort of the equivalent of the biosphere, which is,
Mhm.
by kind of adding the gentle, warming energy of the attention of like, millions of hours of developer attention, we actually have this reversal of entropy, and you have the creation of like this very large cosmological order, which is all this functional software.
Right.
And so if you kind of look at that, it turns out that it's kind of hard to compete with that on a commercial basis, right?
Uh-huh.
Uh, and the reason why is basically this matrix that competes on the basis of consent. So that's the key. That's the key, and it's the key that causes so-called open source money to, effectively be able to outrun proprietary money, because what happens is that the mere existence of open source software places commercial software into its competitive matrix. So what I mean by that is that commercial software competes for dollars, open source software competes for consent. So the thing that's really interesting is that open source software effectively trumps commercial software, right? It
Mhm.
basically it forces commercial software to play on the playing field of open source software, right? So it's basically like, hey, you're no longer playing this game on your terms, you're playing with our rules, right? So
Mhm.
so if you look at it from that vantage point, then what you really see is you see that uh, open source money will effectively force proprietary monies to compete on its playing field. And the thing that I think people can get into, rational actors can get into debates about things like the role of government, and
Mhm.
they can get into rational debates about the role of national regulators, right? And they can really start talking about, well, yes, but one of the big differences is the monopoly on printing money is pretty much state actors.
Mhm.
That means that the behavior of state actors that monopolize the legal framework for the existence of things like money will be protective, and so you can make very logical arguments that this is different from commercial software being overrun by open source software. You can make that argument, but to
Yeah.
me, when you get into that argument, the thing that I want to suggest, and maybe this is a flaw in my reasoning, but I tend to believe that the arc of history bends towards freedom, to paraphrase Dr. King. And if that's true, then governments that forbid people from choosing services, software, and infrastructure that serves them better is basically kind of anti freedom, and so I guess what I'm saying is that it's pretty hard to resist sort of mass action, mass movement. It's hard for governments to forbid people from doing things that serve them better. And to me, like when I look at a Bitcoin or when I look at these kinds of like services, I'm not at all making the claim that those serve people today better than the existing money infrastructure of the world. I'm totally not making that claim. The claim that I'm trying to make is that they inevitably will. That's the claim I'm making, which is that and when I say they, I'm really reflecting on kind of the history of open source software, which is that open source software typically starts out kind of trying to clone the functions of proprietary software, but eventually becomes better, right? And eventually, and so to me, I being in Silicon Valley, my battle cries kind of don't bet against software developers. And I think some of the kind of lesser complaints cryptocurrency, so-called, is those are just software problems, and if you kind of hang out and complain about software problems long enough, they'll be fixed. Even things like Bitcoin uses a lot of electricity. Yes, that's true. I think Bitcoin performs a fundamental function as one of the least trusting blockchains, and so-called, and the whole proof of work construct is pretty cryptographically airtight. But the thing that's interesting about it is yes, it does burn a lot of electricity. If you want the use case where none of the endpoints trust one another, and none of the endpoints trust any of the nodes, and none of the nodes trust each other or any of the endpoints, that's how you do it. And I'm not saying that there's some cool way to design yourself out of using electricity in the case of a Bitcoin. But what I am saying is that there may actually be money use cases where you don't have to have that much trust. And if you end up with a use case like that, then you can make shortcuts and you can do other things. And, and that will save you a lot of money. Because I think if there's any lesson that's sort of lasting with what's happened so far with these things, is that what we've learned that the lack of trust is crazily expensive. And that's kind of why Bitcoin burns so much electricity, is because there's so much lack of trust. And the thing that I think is fair to say is one of the reasons Bitcoin is doing so well, right? And when I say it's doing well is, if you really think about the aggregate billions of dollars that of value that have gone into Bitcoin, it's doing well. And the reason why it's doing well is because it's provably smart not to blithely trust, the existing system.
Yeah.
So I think that's just something that will continue to organically grow over time, which is that we've reached a point in history I like to call peak centralization, and we're really seeing the flaws and limitations of centralizing power. And, because of that, the pendulum is kind of automatically swinging the other way. So, these are all kind of like very, I would say, nuanced positions and arguments. They're very, debatable, but I love to kind of like make sure that these axioms are, out there so that people can reason about this in a novel way. And that's part of what I'm trying to help people with. And, one of the reasons why I kind of continue to press on this topic is it's always been my way of looking at it. And, I think during the hype bubble, I was talking about it in this context, and I continue to talk about it in this context. And so, the thing that's interesting about it is that, a lot of stories change with the price of Bitcoin. But, for me, this story hasn't changed. And, I still think it's an inevitable event in human history.
So, thank you for that. First of all, extremely interesting stuff. Where do you see Evercoin sort of like in the future of, an economy that's evolving towards decentralization, not on any specific timeline?
Yeah, absolutely. So, if you look at this whole kind of story arc, Evercoin is, to me, like a very optimally designed kind of infrastructure. And the thing that's interesting about infrastructure is that there's many different layers or levels of infrastructure, right? But I think the thing that I think is important to understand is really the world of custody. So, in order to understand the design of Evercoin, you really have to understand the principles of custody and cryptographic custody, and it's very, very simple, which is, I think, it's custody is very simple, which is you have to look at something like, where's my key? That's the question of custody.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you buy a house, the first thing that you ask once you bought the house is, where's my key? Someone I shared this with actually asked a secondary question that's also equally clever, which is, and does anyone else have a copy of that key? Right.
Yeah.
Right. Those are great questions. Those are really good questions. If you buy a car, first question you should ask is something like, okay, where's the key? Right. Because having the key means you have ownership, right? And not having the key means for sure you don't have ownership, right? So if someone who sold you a house is like, I'm not going to give you the key, congratulations on your home ownership, like, that's a problem, right? Like, you're like, what just happened? Scam. So now
Right.
you're mad, right? So the thing that people don't do for whatever reason in finance is they don't ask that question. And that question is, and it's because they're not used to it, right? Like in traditional finance, banks are banks and customers are customers. In crypto, customers are banks, right? Like in crypto, everyone who is, like, I know one of the former encryption key holders at Wells Fargo Bank, and guess what? Wells Fargo Bank encryption key holders are using paper wallets, and the paper wallets are stored in, guess what? Bank safes. And and they're multi physical key entry systems, but the thing that's astonishing about all of these little revelations is that effectively the security that a typical Bitcoiner will have over their own wallets is not materially different from obviously in matter of degree, it may be less than the security that a bank has, but in the matter of the processes and the business processes and what they're actually doing to maintain custody is not different from a bank. So to make a long story short, what Evercoin is really developed is an incredibly sophisticated user experience that is similar to that of a custodial experience.
Okay.
But it's all been built in self-custody. So what does that mean? What it means is that, I see this world a little bit like the Matrix, right? Which is, if you the movie, yeah, if you go to a kind of so-called centralized or custodial exchange, uh, you know, you are now in the Matrix, right? You
Right.
really you recreated the banking system, and as soon as you know, people think they're transferring Bitcoin into their account at an exchange. Like, that's not, the blockchain doesn't think that's what's happening, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you know, like the idea is this, right? Is like, let's say Alice wants to put 10 Bitcoins into an exchange, right? So when Alice makes the transfer, Alice is not transferring those to Alice. That transaction is not Alice to Alice. That
Yeah.
transaction is Alice to Bob, right? The exchange is
Mm-hmm.
Bob, right? So Alice suddenly now no longer has custody over that asset, right?
Mm-hmm.
So to me, that's a huge distinction. And so when you look at the role of an Evercoin, essentially what Evercoin is doing is Evercoin has developed a user experience that is very similar to, the kind of consumer enjoyable luxury experience that you get when you're living inside the matrix with fake money, and creating kind of a fake centralized bank that's largely unregulated. So instead of going into that, they're really creating a world that's as pleasant as being inside the matrix, but creating that outside of the matrix, so creating it outside of the custodial financial system, and creating that user experience, inside of the pure crypto ecosystem, right? And it's so funny, right? Because I think what we're fighting against are two major forces, right? One major force is that we're fighting against people who just enjoy being in the matrix,
Mm-hmm.
right? So some people, they just like banks. And admittedly, banks are very convenient because the biggest thing about a bank is that you don't actually have to worry about custody,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because really, like, Big Brother will take care of everything. So that's one, right? The other thing that we're kind of fighting against are sort of hardcore people that are really used to being outside the matrix, right? And so
Right.
for them, they're used to eating crappy food, and they're used to kind of really crappy services, and they're really used to kind of like, things being unpleasant and gnarly. And so to me, it's fascinating because I think eventually everyone will be liberated from the matrix, and so I think, it's really a matter of time, and I think that what's important is for, people to really develop a taste for life outside the matrix. So I guess to make a long story short, the role of Evercoin is to offer, I think, a very good user experience in the context of self-custody. And when you think about what does that mean, what it really means is it means that you're going to need some kind of a wallet. So what's the best kind of a wallet? Well, probably a mobile wallet, right?
Mm-hmm.
The thing that we want to add to the mobile wallet, obviously multi-coin. So we want to have lots of different coin support. And then on top of that, what you ideally want is you want hardware security. So, we're working on solutions there.
Mm-hmm.
Ledger just announced the first kind of Bluetooth connected mobile hardware wallet, which I think is terrific, right? So far, hardware wallets have mostly been kind of to laptop or desktop, and now we're kind of getting to the evolution where it's connecting to mobile, which I think is good. And then I think that, beyond that, the ability to kind of exchange, I think it's that just makes sense. So I think we're building essentially a very nice experience for people that care about the topic of custody.
So as far as custody is concerned on Evercoin as it stands right at this moment, what is if I'm a user of the exchange, what does that look like for me?
Yeah. So effectively, what happens is that it's funny because Evercoin is kind of characterized as an exchange, but it may actually be better characterized as a wallet, right? And the reason
Right.
why I say that is that the primary experience of it is really more of the context of a wallet, and the wallet has kind of an intrinsic ability to exchange,
Mhm.
and it has things that I think in the custodial world seem obvious. But what's really interesting about the non-custodial world is that it's inobvious. For example, you can do exchange, which I think makes sense, but what about something like limit orders, right? So limit orders, it's such an interesting thing to happen. Like, what is the concept of a non-custodial limit order? Well, it's quite interesting. I think from a technology perspective, we've built something new, and there isn't a wallet that allows you to set a limit order because it really bends the laws of physics to understand what's actually happening technically. And I think at that point you do have to enter into a trusted contractual relationship, which is what you're effectively doing is that you're signing a transaction
Mhm.
that takes place in the future with a counterparty, at an agreed upon price, right? But the theory, the issue there becomes, it is possible for that counterparty to um, take the transaction and not give you anything in return. So I think the thing that I think we're really doing with respect to kind of adding these features is that we're really adding the features in a way that gives the user as intuitive of an experience as possible, and minimizes kind of the trust exposure. Because I think when you look at the traditional centralized model, it's not the amount of the transactions at risk, it's the amount of the principal. Like it's the entire amount that you transferred from day one that's at risk, and I think that's a less pleasant reality. So I think
Mhm.
from our perspective, um, we want to add everything that you're used to having, with the same kind of speed ideally, and the same kind of user experience, but we'd like to do so on behalf of people who want custody. So, really literally what it means is it means that, when you create a wallet, in Evercoin, like you're getting the key, right? And you have to kind of like maintain privacy and, custody and security over the key that you get. And that can be in the form of passphrases, and you can, there are kind of simplifications, but all the simplifications require you to accept, slightly less security, right? So for
Mhm.
example, you do have the option to, encode the key into some kind of a password, but I think as soon as you do that, you make it easier for people to kind of guess what that is or hack what that
Mhm.
is. But I think at the same time, from our side, these things we just have to give the users, things that they feel relatively comfortable with. But at the end of the day, like the user has to have custody, and the reality is even if you tie your key to a password, it doesn't mean that we have your key, right? It means
Mhm.
that there is a encoding that you've created, and obviously, that means that you are subject to one of the fundamental laws of cryptocurrency assets, which is, if you lose your key, that's on you. So, it's that is a difficulty, but it's, that's the reality of how things work, and in a way, I think one of the things that we've been all working with as an industry is that reality, right? Which is,
Mhm.
I think anyone who's been in the crypto space for a while, they probably dropped a key somewhere along the line. I lost a key to a Neo wallet that had a few things in it because they had a really weird user interface on the wallet,
Mhm.
and I really didn't know what the heck I was doing. So,
Oh
so
no.
I locked myself out. But like, to make a long story short, I think that um, in an evolving space, we all have to kind of like develop new standards for how to best do these things. I think much better standards are coming.
Yeah. I'm just, what do you think that will look like?
I think a consumer grade custodial paradigm may relate to something like multi-factor biometrics. So,
Okay. Yeah.
you know, I think that would create, a combination of a high degree of certainty and security, as well as a high degree of ease of use. I do think that it would have to be fairly sophisticated, and not fairly naive. So, for example, like a face, you shouldn't be able to spoof a face of a person with a photograph of that person. So obviously, you would need to really maintain a high degree of security and certainty. And you need a measure in that scenario. You need a measure of recoverability. So you probably would need some recovery mechanic. So, but I think to me, what you'd want is you'd want the multi-factor biometric to be an access mechanism, but not a complete replacement for ownership of the key. And I think
Mhm.
ownership of the key would be essentially sort of the final, uh, you know, I hate to call it a backdoor, but they call it the sort of final resolution of custody, but it
Mhm.
wouldn't necessarily be the daily experience. And the reason why I'm kind of framing it this way is, like let's say you were using your face to open your wallet. If you had some kind of disfiguring accident or plastic surgery, or maybe you grew a beard, I presumably it'd be hard for you to grow a beard, but like, you know, whatever change in your facial appearance, you wouldn't want to suddenly never have access to that wallet again, right? So
Right.
that's why I don't think something like that could replace the existence of a key. But instead of thinking of it as replacing the existence of the key, think of it more like it would allow you to have convenient daily usage. uh, you know, and I guess the thing that it doesn't serve from a use case perspective is that, there may be additional trade-offs, right? Like, for
Mhm.
example, you know, the provision of such technology and services may require a degree of centralization that becomes a regulatory enforcement choke point, right? So, for example, if you have, you know, face recognition and biometric multi-factor authentication, you may actually have a centralization choke point for KYC, and then you
Mhm.
may lose things like cryptographic anonymity, right? So, I guess what I would say is this: is that it's one of these things that is definitely a fast evolving component of this space. I do
Right.
think that we're going to have better solutions. And again, like I think we're not going to have monolithic solutions, so it isn't going to be one solution that's going to fit everything. But I think in terms of things like the consumer management of private keys, I think we definitely need to improve. I think we've got, we're not years away from really good solutions in that space.
Mhm. Miko, before we go, you know, thanks again for everything that you've offered here today. This has been really enlightening, interesting conversation. Are there any things on the roadmap for Evercoin or for Gumi Cryptos or for you that you'd like to share with our audience?
Yeah, so I think from the Evercoin perspective, we're definitely excitedly working on a number of cool projects. We're looking at essentially a desktop trading capability. We're looking at hardware wallet capabilities. You can follow us on evercoin.com, or just download and try the app. I think that's an easy way to kind of understand what it is that we're doing and where we're going. I think from the Gumi Cryptos perspective, we did have the good fortune, and luck of our timing to really be, if you go to gumi-cryptos.com or just Google Gumi Cryptos, you can see our portfolio. So we've made some, I think, judicious investments. We do have a USD denominated fund, so we continue to deploy capital into this bearish condition. And from
Mhm.
our perspective, we're really almost effectively dollar cost averaging the bottom of the market, presuming that the bottom of the market doesn't last for the next, you know, 5 years or so. As a
Mhm.
venture fund, we want to continue to deploy capital because some of the biggest companies in the previous dot-com wave were built during kind of the so-called crash. All the kind of Amazon-sized companies were really weathered that downturn post-bubble very, very effectively. So, I guess from my vantage point, if you're curious about stuff I've talked about, Evercoin.com, Miko.com, Miko.com, that's my personal website, and Gumi Cryptos, and you can GUMI, so you can easily Google that, or it's just gumi-cryptos.com. So, feel free to have a look and, let me know if you have any further questions.